I had a question this week from a colleague, and he was asking, where is the best place to host the integration runtime for ADF? There are two options. The first one is to use a virtual managed network, which is a platform as a service, and the other one is to have a self-hosted integration runtime. There is the auto-resolve integration runtime, which allows you to connect to some services in Azure, but it doesn't allow you to connect to, for example, a SQL managed instance into its subnet, which requires its own dedicated subnet in a virtual network. And it doesn't allow you to connect to Azure Data Lake storage if you want to use a private endpoint. So let's have a look at what these terms mean. So we have these cloud models here. This is from Microsoft. I'll put a link in the description below to this image. But if you go from left to right, the further you go to the right, the more that Microsoft will manage for you. So if you're after a managed service, then I think platform as a service is the way to go, because the integration runtime itself is managed by Microsoft, as is all of the networking, all of the operating system, like the virtual machine that it's running on. All that stuff you don't need to worry about. If you go for the self-hosted integration runtime, then you're in the second column, where you need to deploy the virtual machine. Microsoft will look after the servers and the storage and the networking side, but you need to deploy a VNet for your VM to connect to the managed instance. You also need to patch the OS, and you need to install the integration runtime manually and then connect that to the ADF service. So let's just quickly sketch out our infrastructure. There is a bicep template which deploys all of this for you. So we've got our SQL managed instance, and it has a database inside there. And we have our VNet down here. Let's call this VNet. And just imagine it's kind of like a router. So we've got our connection point, and from there we have our managed instance subnet. So let's call this managed instance. So this is a subnet, and that will be connected to the managed instance. We also have, if we want to test out the self-hosted integration runtime, a VM subnet, which is connected to the same VNet, but it will be a slightly different address range. So talking about address ranges, let's say this is 10.0.0/16, and let's give this one 10.0.0.0/24, and this one 10.0.1.0/24. So these are bog standard address ranges that a lot of people use. Now, we've got our ADF instance running in Azure. Let's just draw this down here. We have Data Lake. So what we want to do is bring some data from Data Lake. So I didn't draw that very well. ADLS. I've removed my box by mistake. So we've got our Data Lake, we've got ADF, and we've got SQL Managed Instance, and we want to connect these all together using Platform as a Service, using the previous diagram. So how do we do that? So all we need to do is, in Azure Data Factory, you can deploy a managed VNet. And what that will do is it will deploy a virtual network. Let's do it in light green here. And let's call this managed VNet. It will deploy a managed network, and it will be in a different address space from your managed instance network here. I don't know how that's actually calculated, how that bit works, but when I did it, I found that the address spaces were not overlapping, so there were no IP address conflicts, which is what you want. And this ADF, what it will do, this managed VNet, sorry, it will deploy a virtual machine. So let's do that in orange. And inside there will be an integration runtime, which you do not need to configure, you don't need to install, it's all done for you, which is one of the benefits of Platform as a Service. So this VM is deployed. You can't see this VM in the portal, Azure portal. You can't access the integration runtime either. It's all transparent to you, but it is there. This VM is connected into this managed VNet. Let's just draw another router there. So that's connected into this managed VNet, and the integration runtime is connected to ADF using over the public internet or the Microsoft backbone. Then what you can do is, once that is deployed, it will create a link to your internal network. So when you connect the managed VNet into your network, it will connect a kind of a network peering. Again, this is all transparent, so you won't see that. When I did it, this was given an address space of 10.250.0.0/16. Okay, and this integration runtime VM here was 10.250.6.0/24. So this was in a VM subnet, and the Azure Data Lake, when I created a private endpoint for that, that was 10.250.2.0/24. Okay, so that will be connected to that as well. So once you've connected your private endpoints to your managed VNet, I'll show you that in a minute, you will find that you'll now have the ability to connect ADF to Azure Data Lake storage and a SQL managed instance using the private managed VNet and private endpoint connections. They've got different names. I get confused with the names. So if ADF is running here, you're authoring your pipeline. When you want to connect to your data sources, you need to basically warm up the integration runtime. You need to turn on this VM. Okay, I'll show you that now. So if we go to the Azure portal and we have our resources, all of these resources get deployed by the bicep template that I've supplied in the GitHub link in the description below. So if you want to deploy this out and test it out yourself, feel free to do that. The MI will take 3 hours to deploy, unfortunately, but subsequent deployments will be much quicker. So if we go to our ADF and then launch Data Studio, I've already got it open, so here it is here. So if we go to integration runtimes, we've got our auto resolve one here. We click new, and we want to do Azure self-hosted, and we want to choose Azure. We don't want to do self-hosted at this point. We're going to just do the private managed network, managed virtual network, sorry. And we'll call this private managed integration runtime, or IR. We'll auto-resolve it to the correct region. It will figure out what region it should be. And let's enable the virtual network configuration and tick this box here, which enables you to connect when you're authoring, building pipelines, to connect to your sources and your sinks and, you know, preview data and all that kind of thing, and run debug, that kind of stuff. All very important, so you will need that. It has a time to live, so if you go to lunch and come back, and you will find that if you don't set this value to a long enough period, then the VM will shut down and you'll need to come in here and enable it again. So let's just create our integration runtime now. Have a cup of tea. It takes about 5 minutes or so to create. And once it's created, it will take a couple of minutes for the actual VM to start up, to be deployed and start up. So that's actually a lot quicker than I expected. So that's running already. It's the private managed integration runtime. And if we go to our virtual network, we can see that the VM is currently starting up, which takes up to 2 minutes, something like that. So what we've done, if we go back to the whiteboard, is we've just deployed this managed VNet, this VM, and an integration runtime. And then that will connect to ADF, and we're able to connect to our resources. So in order to connect to our resources, let's just see if it's up yet. No, it's still running. Let's just pause and come back when that's done. So that looks like it's done. So let's have a look and go back into there. Virtual network, and that's all up and running. So now what we need to do is give permission for ADF to connect to the managed instance, and we do that with managed private endpoints. So Microsoft will manage the endpoints for us, so we don't need to worry about that. So we're going to connect to Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. Let's look for that. This is still in preview, by the way, so this is quite a new thing. I'm sure that'll be out of preview soon. And we'll give this SQLMI, and let's call it private endpoint. Let's just give it a long name so we know what it is. So choose your subscription, and then we're going to choose our managed instance name, which is that one there that we've deployed. And that will now create a managed endpoint to the SQL managed instance. Now, what it doesn't do is it doesn't create, let's go back to the whiteboard, What I thought when I initially did this, when I first started with this technology, I thought it would create an IP address on this VM subnet here to connect, but it doesn't. It creates an IP address in this virtual network here, in the 10.250 network. That might differ to what you have. So that's now basically creating this peered virtual network link from ADF to the SQL managed instance. So that will take a couple of minutes to deploy. And the provision, so see that it's succeeded. If you see that it says provisioning for a long time, what you need to do is go to the managed instance and approve this connection. So this is quite secure. So let's go over to the managed instance. And what you need to do is go down to private endpoint connections. And notice that we've got a new one that's popped in here, and we need to approve that connection. So if you tick approve, you can put in a response message if you want. So once that's approved, once that's finished, we should then be able to test our connection through to the test database. So let's have a look. So while we're waiting for that to approve, let's create a managed private endpoint to Azure Data Lake storage. So if we click new, and if we scroll down to Azure Data Lake Gen 2, click continue, and we'll just call this Azure Data Lake Storage Private Endpoint. And choose our subscription, choose our storage account. There's our storage account. Click create. And we should now get a approval required to access the Azure Data Lake. So that's now provisioning. And the SQLMI endpoint looks like it's succeeded. So we should now be able to connect to the managed instance. So let's give that a go, shall we? And let's create a link service to the managed instance now. So I clicked the wrong thing. Let's go to managed instance. Just call it Azure SQLMI. So we'll choose which runtime we want to use. So we want to connect over the managed virtual network. So let's choose that. Let's choose our subscription. Let's choose our server name. And we're going to go over the private endpoint. The public endpoint is not enabled. And we're going to use mytestdb. And we're going to use Azure Key Vault to get the secret. We've got a user called markadmin, and we're going to use Key Vault, and we're going to use the secret name of markadmin. So now let's test that out, shall we? It's testing the connection. So this is now connecting over the managed VNet to the SQL managed instance, and connection successful. So if we click create, we now have a managed instance linked service in ADF, which we can connect to through Platform as a Service integration runtime. So let's publish that. And that's all good. So let's look at the integration runtimes again to see how Data Lake's getting on. So I need to come down here, manage private endpoints. So we can see the provision has succeeded, but it's the approval status is pending. So to get to that, if you just click on it, there's a link at the bottom here called Manage Approvals in Azure Portal. If you can click on that, it's like a shortcut to where you need to be, and it will take you to the place you need to be. And if you go to Private Endpoint Connections, you can then tick the box and approve the link. The description is requested by Data Factory, so we'll leave that in there. We'll say yes. So what we're doing here is approving a private link to Azure Data Lake. And if we check the networking for Data Lake, we'll see that enabled from all networks is not selected. So that means that you will not be able to access this Azure Data Lake using the public URL. It's blocked. You will be able to access it through the private managed endpoint, which makes that more secure. So let's go back to Data Factory. That approval should now be happening. That says it's approved. And if we go back in here, while that's creating, while the approval is happening, if we go to the SQLMI private endpoint, if you can scroll down here, you can see down here that you can see the endpoint private IP. 10.250.26.0, if you see that in your managed instance, you will know that it's coming from the Azure Data Factory here. Let's see if that's created yet. So that's all been done. So if we click on Azure Data Lake, private endpoint. We can see here that that is 10.250.0.7. Okay, so let's create a link service to Azure Data Lake. And let's go to Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, Azure Data Lake Storage private endpoint. So we need to choose private managed IR, which is the one we created earlier. And we're going to use system assigned managed identity. And for this to work, you need to have granted access to this managed identity. This will fail because I don't think I've created that yet. So you need to go into Azure role assignments on the data lake and grant access. You need to give it storage blob data contributor access to this managed identity. So I'm just going to do that now. Okay, so I've just gone over and added the role assignment. I didn't want to show that, you'd probably get bored. So if we now test the connection, we should see that this now has permission. It doesn't, so that failed. Why did it fail? Storage authorization on test connection forbidden. Doesn't have enough permission to access the data. Okay, so let's have another look. So it turns out I was just too hasty. So as you can see, I just tested it again. Just needed to wait a minute and then it will work. So just bear that in mind. It may take a minute for all of this stuff to be created and visible in the portal. So let's create our link service. So we now have an end-to-end solution where we can use Data Factory to create a data set in the Azure Data Lake, pull data from there, and then put it into the Azure SQL managed instance. So if you don't have your integration runtime running, then you won't be able to test your connections or build your pipelines. Let's just quickly go back to our diagram. So what we're going to do now is, very briefly, we're going to create a virtual machine. Well, we've already got our virtual machine that's already been deployed. And that's going to be connected to here. And we're going to create an integration runtime. Let's do that a different color. Let's do it in orange. So we've got an integration runtime. We're going to install this service on this VM and then connect that to ADF. So that will allow ADF to then connect through to the managed instance, and it will connect through to the Azure Data Lake as well. So let's go back, and what you need to do is install it manually. I don't think you can even automate this actually. What you could do is create an image of this VM, so you can install it manually and then image it. So if you want to deploy VMs in the future, or in an automated way, you can deploy that image. That's one way you could do that. Not sure if there's one in the gallery already. Maybe there is. I haven't checked. So we're just going to install the integration runtime now, and I'll just come back when that's done. So when that's happened, you'll get this box will pop up, and you'll need to get the key, which I've already copied to the clipboard. So this key here from the runtime in the Azure portal, go back to the VM, you need to paste that key in so that it can connect securely. Click register, and that will then register this self-hosted integration runtime with Azure Data Factory, and you'll be able to do your ETL. And then when you come back to the portal, you can see that we now have our integration runtime, self-hosted, is up and running, and that should be able to connect. Because the VM is in the same VNet, that should be able to connect okay. So if we create another link service to the managed instance, if you go to Azure, and go to managed instance, and we call this self-hosted, and let's go to choose our self-hosted runtime, and choose our subscription, choose our integration, our SQLMI, use the private endpoint, and we're going to use mytestdb, and we're going to use markadmin, and scroll down, use Key Vault, and select Azure Key Vault, and the secret name is markadmin. Let's test that connection. So we're now going through the virtual machine instead of through the private managed network. Click create. We now have two connections to the managed instance. One is over the private managed network, and the other one is over inside your own VNet. So if we go back to the diagram, this second one that we've just done is going from this VM and just through here, so it's a much shorter route. Whereas if you're going from here through the managed VNet, you're going through this integration runtime into this managed VNet through this peered link, and then up into the managed instance that way. But both of them work fine. And if we go to, I did some performance tests, and it seems to me that, in a nutshell, that they perform fairly similarly. The Microsoft hosted managed virtual network took about 15 minutes for the UK price paid data. I tried a 2 vCore 4 gig RAM self-hosted runtime, and that took slightly less time. I then tried a beefy 32 core 128 gigs of RAM, that took 10 minutes. And then I tried the Microsoft recommended config for a self-hosted VM for the integration runtime, which is 4 vCores and 8 gigs RAM. That's what Microsoft recommend, and that actually was the best performer overall. So if you're going to go self-hosted, I recommend this configuration. If you're going to go managed, then I think the performance, it is slightly worse. For 30 million rows, 5 gig of data, it took 15 minutes as opposed to 8 or 9 with a self-hosted. So I hope that helped and gave you food for thought. So my recommendation really is, if you can, go with platform as a service, go with a managed virtual network. Of course, the managed instance is still in preview, so I wouldn't do that in production just yet, but just wait a few months and hopefully that will be general availability. Hope you found it useful.